By 1957, Lucille Ball was the most powerful woman in Hollywood, not just the funniest, not just the most beloved, the most powerful. She and her husband owned an entire studio, 35 acres of it, purchased from one of the most legendary names in the business. She had done what no actress before her had ever done. She had turned her fame into ownership. But here is what most people never knew. Just a few years earlier, she had been dismissed, passed over, told in so many words that her ideas were too risky, her instincts too unconventional, and her husband, a Cuban-born bandleader, too foreign for American living rooms. So how does a woman the system tried to push aside end up owning the system itself? And what did she do in one quiet moment in 1960 that no woman in Hollywood had ever done before? That is the story of Lucille Ball, and it starts not in Hollywood, but in a small town in western New York, during the hardest years this country ever knew. Stay with us, because the answer, when it comes, will surprise you. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the late 1920s to Jamestown, New York, where a young girl named Lucille Ball was already performing for anyone who would watch. If you were in your teens or 20s during the Great Depression, you know exactly what that era felt like. Work was scarce. Dreams felt dangerous. And for a girl from a working-class family with no connections and no money, the idea of making it in show business was, by any reasonable measure, a fantasy. Lucille Ball did not care about reasonable measures. She left for New York City as a teenager, enrolled in a drama school, and was promptly told she had no talent. She kept going. She found work as a model. She found small parts. She made her way slowly and stubbornly to Hollywood. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, she worked steadily, dozens of films, mostly forgettable, mostly supporting roles. The studios called her a contract player, a reliable face. She was good. But according to the people making decisions at the time, she was not a star. And then came radio, and then came a man named Desi Arnaz. She met Desi on a film set in the early 1940s. He was a musician, a performer, full of energy and charm. They married quickly, too quickly, some said. The marriage was turbulent. The separations were frequent. But the connection between them was real, and it would eventually change everything. By the late 1940s, Lucille Ball was starring in a radio comedy called My Favorite Husband. The show was a hit. CBS wanted to bring it to television. And here is where the story takes its first sharp turn. Lucille told CBS she wanted to do the television version with Desi as her husband. CBS said no. Audiences, the network insisted, would never believe an American woman married to a Cuban man. It was too unusual, too risky. So what did Lucille Ball do when the most powerful network in America told her no? She proved them wrong in the most direct way possible. Lucille and Desi took their act on the road. They developed a live vaudeville-style show, the two of them together, performing for real audiences across the country. The crowds loved them. The chemistry was undeniable. The laughter was real. They brought the evidence back to CBS. The network relented, but there was a condition. CBS would not pay to produce the show in the way Lucille wanted. They would not film it on the West Coast. They would not use a live studio audience. And they would not give Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz creative control. So Lucille and Desi made a decision that, at the time, seemed almost reckless. They formed their own production company, Desilu Productions, and they offered to produce the show themselves. They would take a lower salary in exchange for ownership of the filmed episodes. The network agreed, almost certainly because they believed the filmed episodes had little long-term value. Television in those days was considered disposable. You broadcast it once, maybe twice, and then it was gone. That assumption that television reruns were worthless would turn out to be one of the most expensive mistakes a network ever made. I Love Lucy premiered in October of 1951. If you were alive then, and if you were in your mid-teens by that point, you were part of the first generation to grow up with television in the home, you may remember what happened next. The show did not just succeed, it dominated. Within months, it was the most watched program in the country. By its second season, it was estimated that more Americans were watching Lucy on Monday nights than had voted in the previous presidential election. Department stores reportedly shifted their hours. Neighbors gathered at the homes of the few families on the block who owned a television set. And here is the moment that answered our first question, the one about why CBS fought so hard to keep Daisy off the show. The network had been wrong, completely wrong. American audiences did not reject Desi Arnaz, they embraced him. The Ricardos, Lucy and Ricky, their landlords Ethel and Fred, became, for millions of families, as familiar as neighbors. The marriage at the center of the show, an American woman and a Cuban man, was never treated as unusual on screen. It simply was. And in that quiet, ordinary normalcy, Lucille Ball had done something quietly radical. But Desilu Productions was just getting started. Through the mid-1950s, as I Love Lucy continued to break records, Lucille and Daisy were reinventing how television was made. Their technical team pioneered the use of multiple cameras filming in front of a live studio audience, a format that became the standard for nearly every sitcom that followed. They developed systems for filming, editing, and distributing episodes that the entire industry would eventually adopt. And then came the question planted earlier, the one about how the woman the studios had dismissed could end up owning a studio of her own. By the late 1950s, Desilu was producing not just their own projects, but shows for other networks and studios. The company had grown into a genuine production powerhouse. And when the RKO studio lot, the same studio where Lucille Ball had once been a contract player, one face among hundreds, came up for sale, Desilu bought it. The woman they had dismissed now owned the building. But the story does not end there. In some ways, the hardest chapter was still ahead. By the late 1950s, the marriage between Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz was breaking down. The pressures of running a studio, the long separations, the personal struggles, it had taken a toll that neither of them could repair. They divorced in 1960, and here is where the second question we planted finds its answer, the quiet moment in 1960 that changed Hollywood. What did Lucille Ball do when the marriage that had built the empire came to an end? She bought Daisy out. Lucille Ball became the sole owner and president of Desilu Productions, making her, at that moment, the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio. Not an executive, not a figurehead, the owner, the decision-maker, the person who greenlit the projects, signed the contracts, and set the direction. And in that role, she made two decisions that would define American television for decades. Desilu Productions greenlit Star Trek and Mission. Impossible, two shows that other studios had passed on, two shows that the conventional wisdom said were too strange, too expensive, too risky. According to accounts from the era, it was Lucille Ball herself who pushed both projects forward over the objections of her own board. The woman they had told was too risky had, once again, trusted her instincts. Lucille Ball eventually sold Desilu to Gulf and Western in the late 1960s, and the studio was absorbed into what became Paramount Television. She walked away with a sum that, by any measure, reflected the empire she had built. She continued performing. She continued working. She never fully stepped away from the craft that had driven her since that teenage girl left Jamestown with nothing but ambition. She passed away in the spring of 1989. She was 77 years old, and that brings us back to the question we started with. How does a woman the system tried to sideline end up owning the system itself? The answer is that Lucille Ball never accepted the terms the industry offered her. When they said no to Desi, she built her own audience and forced their hand. When they refused to give her creative control, she formed her own company and took it. When the marriage that built the studio ended, she did not step aside, she stepped up. Every brick of that kingdom was laid in defiance of someone who had told her it could not be done. For the audience that grew up watching I Love Lucy, and if you were a child in the early 1950s, you were among the very first generation of Americans to grow up with television as a constant presence in your home. Lucille Ball was simply Lucy. Funny, warm, beloved, but behind that character was a woman of extraordinary will. A businesswoman, a pioneer, a person who understood earlier than almost anyone that in the new world of television, ownership was power. She did not just perform in the golden age of television, she built it. Memory, if you grew up watching I Love Lucy, you know something that is hard to put into words. There was a rhythm to those Monday evenings, the smell of dinner still in the air, the sound of the test pattern fading, a sense that whatever else was happening in the world, and in the early 1950s there was plenty. For 30 minutes, the living room belonged to Lucy. Maybe you watched with your mother. Maybe you remember the neighbors crowding in because your family had the only set on the block. Maybe you remember the way your parents laughed, really laughed, at something on television for the first time. Lucille Ball gave this country that, not just comedy, a shared moment, a ritual, a reminder that laughter, even in uncertain times, was something that belonged to everyone. What do you remember most about watching Lucy? We would love to hear your memories in the comments below. Did you watch I Love Lucy when it first aired? Do you have a favorite episode or a memory of watching it with someone special? If this story moved you, please subscribe to Golden Age Stories. Every week, we bring you the real stories behind the people and moments that shaped the America you grew up in. Next time, we are going back to the era of the great American variety show, and the man who made Saturday nights must-see television for an entire generation. We will see you there.